my way through. So this talk is very informal. It's very loose. I haven't figured it all out. My PowerPoint doesn't have captions, it's all that kind of stuff. And it's on art and aging and the life cycle. And I got into this topic. It's this topic I kept bumping into. I remember figuring out years ago, I didn't realize this, I'll say much more about it. Starting in 1971, Georgia O'Keeffe could not see. She had macular degeneration, but she continued to paint and to make art. And that was interesting. A guy named Emerson Wolfer, who many of, if you are Californians, you'll know who he is. He had macular degeneration, but continued to make art, well into his career, into an advanced age. The abstract expressionist artist Hedda Stern, who passed away not that many years ago. She was over 100 years old, but she was one of the few women that was part of the group of the abstract expressionists. Hedda Stern had macular degeneration, but she continued to make art. And it sort of sunk in. And then when I arrived here at Santa Barbara, I knew that one of the shows I wanted to try to think about was how it is artists deal with the realities of aging and the life cycle, and how they continue to be creative. And I hope the reason for or why this is a good topic is kind of obvious. The art world, particularly in LA, is like obsessed with youth. Like, I'm old in the art world in LA. I'm like, I even feel it sometimes lately. Like, I grew up without social media. I got a social media account when I was in my early 20s. But there's an obsession with youth. There's a really strong bias and a lot of kind of stereotypes that are directed at older people. And there is a presumption, which I think is wrong, but it's so ingrained that it's unconscious, that somehow innovation is connected with youth. And that's just all not true. That's not true at all. So I kind of wanted to do a project about those issues. So that's what this is the beginning of today. And I'm going to talk about Matisse and Georgia O'Keeffe, who've probably been talked about more than they need to. But I've started out with them because their health issues and how they respond to them are really well documented. And then the other thing I've learned with the topic of art and aging is that some people don't want maybe aren't comfortable with that frame. So, which I can understand, because there's so much bad, there's so much negativity that's attached with aging in our culture. So with an artist like Matisse or with O'Keeffe, that's not a concern. I can just sort of begin to think about these issues. But what I'm hoping in our discussion, when I get to the end of this, my presentation, I really hope you'll talk about artists I need to research, people whose practice changed because of the aging process, or really whatever. So this for me is an example, or an instance for me to kind of talk about where I'm at, where I'm thinking, and then I'm really interested to hear what all of you are thinking about, because you're all artists, and all of us are dealing with some version of the life cycle, because we're all getting older day by day. But I think it'll be a very interesting discussion for me, and I know I'll learn a lot. So I'm going to screen share. So let me do that. Hold on. Okay. And if this is working, you should see art and aging preliminary thoughts. Is that working?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Yes.
Cool. Okay. So, and I'm going to turn my video off if I can, just because. Okay, but you can still hear me. Okay.
Right.
So
We can't hear you.
Well, that's because I'm not talking. Give me a second. I have to figure out where I am on the page. that's, just 1 second. Okay. So the idea of late work is as old as art history. In his Lives of the Artists, Vasari, the first modern biographer of artists, the Italian Renaissance painter and writer, talked about the early, middle, and late periods of an artist's work. Early, we can guess what that is. It's a youthful artist, always male, we should add, working under the tutelage of another artist in that artist's studio, learning the tools of the trade, crucially learning how to draw. That's what they spent a lot of time doing, learning how to prepare materials. Then we'll say a mature artistic flowering. Usually that involves a break with the master. So he gets out of the master's studio and he starts to do something else. And then a period of late work, which for Vasari is often characterized by decadence or eccentricity. So for someone like Paolo Uccello, Uccello was known to be obsessed with geometry, and Vasari claims late in his career, his paintings go off the rails because they're too geometric. But it frequently for Vasari, the late work becomes something he sort of criticizes, and he compares unfavorably to the period of the middle period. Now, Vasari's hero is Michelangelo. And Michelangelo, we have one of his last sculpture, the Rondinini Pietà, and it is unfinished. But even so Vasari is very critical of lots of artists. So who are older artists. So kind of from the very beginning of modern Western art in the Renaissance, there's this bias built in against older artists. So you've got 3 examples. These are well-known artists, examples you've heard of late work. We've got the last piece Michelangelo's assumed to work on, the Rondinini Pietà, that is in a state of non-finito or deliberately unfinished. A painting by Titian that's at the St. Louis Art Museum of Christ that I'm particularly fond of, that it's from the last couple of years of his life. I'm not sure that the quality of the image gets through, but it's a very thickly worked canvas. There's a tremendous amount of paint that seems to kind of accrete on the surface. And you really, when you see this in person, it's as if you're looking at something that's almost some kind of 3-dimensional fabric. You know, there's just so much paint and surface and texture. On the screen and relatively small, it resolves much more cleanly into a picture than what it really is. And then Rembrandt, who late in life, we all know, spent all his money, had all sorts of problems, had health issues. And the late work has frequently a sense of introspection and darkness, which you certainly can see here, and just beautifully worked up and kind of clotted surface where you just have this sense of lots of paint being deposited on it. With all 3, there's this sense of I think, indistinctness, or work that's not as sort of crisp and polished as it might have been earlier in their career. I don't see that as a problem, but some people, there's some ways in which late work gets framed as less defined, less focused, etc. But I think it's quite clear with these 3 artists that they had an aesthetic agenda. And there's every reason to believe that, it's hard to know what Michelangelo would have done, but by the time he died, he was 88. And he worked on the piece off and on for many, many years the last 15 years of his life. So I'm willing to call it as it's probably mostly finished. It's not just that he passed away before he could finish it. So this early, middle, late division, let me go back, sorry. This early, middle, late division gets in the way. I don't think it's all that helpful because it imposes an equation with age and style that probably just isn't correct. Artists are, if nothing else, unique. And as gerontologists stress, older people frequently fall outside the bell curve. So this is a sort of fact. The quote unquote normal range of functionality for bodily organs or bodily processes in the US today is based on middle-aged people. These are where the clinical standards are still mostly written for middle-aged people in good health. But we all know, even anecdotally, that the range of abilities for people in their 80s and 90s is massive. And so whether it's art historians trying to put people in early, middle, and late boxes, or physicians and clinicians trying to shoehorn individuals into kind of clinically normal ideas, there's a way in which getting older doesn't sit well with the bell curve or with standard ideas about statistics and demographics, et cetera. So that's one big point, and one thing I've taken away from reading the gerontological literature over the last 6 months is just a lot of what we have in place in our culture that's imposed on older people was based on clinical studies from much younger people who did not have any kind of health issues. And that leads to all sorts of problems. Now, we have some of Michelangelo's reflections on old age. And as I mentioned before, he died at the age of 88, and so he had time to think about it. But it's a nice quote. "The voyage of my life at last has been reached, across a stormy sea and a fragile boat. The common port all must pass through to give an account of every evil and pious deed. So now I recognize how laden with error was the affectionate fantasy that made art an idol and sovereign to me, like all things men want in spite of their best interests." At least here in this sonnet, this aged master of the Italian Renaissance expresses, and almost kind of unbelievably, misgivings about his total devotion to art. So the very thing that is why we're talking about him today, and I'm talking about him today, his entire legacy, he seems to be casting aside here as kind of vanity. Now, Michelangelo, we know, was a very devout Catholic, and so faced with his impending death, and immersed in his Christian worldview about the essential sinfulness of humans, he doubted the importance of his art. The eternal salvation offered to him through his Christian beliefs were sort of put up against the fleeting recognition of fame and prominence. However, when we get to modern artists like Matisse and Georgia O'Keeffe, they took a very different view of this autumnal period of their life. There was no late in life doubting about the relevance of their work. And in fact, for Matisse and Georgia O'Keeffe, and in very well documented ways, both went in new creative directions. Matisse towards his glorious cutouts, and O'Keeffe with a small but nonetheless powerful group of abstractions from the 1970s and a few sculptures from the 1980s, not many. While I'm not sure about Michelangelo's clinical history, it is a fact that Matisse and O'Keeffe had substantial health issues to contend with. Substantial health issues that required them to work and to make art in wholly new ways. So first, Matisse. In January of 1941, Matisse had been diagnosed with cancer and traveled from his home on the coast of France to Lyon to see a specialist whom he had been advised to see because that was the very best surgeon to operate on him for his colon cancer. January of 1941 was a difficult year in France. The Germans occupied the north, and Marshal Pétain was ruling the south from Vichy. Also, in Matisse's private life, his wife, whom he was estranged to at this time, he was living with his mistress, Lydia Delextraya, but Matisse was estranged from his wife and daughter, whom he both knew were active in the resistance and were eventually arrested by the Gestapo. So trouble in his personal life, trouble with his health, and then a very difficult situation. He later said of this journey to Lyon, it was the longest journey I ever made, and he was fully prepared to die on the operating table. And I also feel like I got to interject here. I'm not normally one who dwells on these kinds of personal details of people's lives and medical history, but I feel like for the questions I'm interested in, it's important to understand what was happening. And it's only by thinking about all of this that we can really appreciate all that Matisse accomplished for the next 13 years of his life, after the surgery he had. So it's not the way I've been trained to do art history or criticism, but I think in this case it matters and it's relevant. While the surgeries, the various surgeries were successful, 2 portions of his large intestine were removed, and only a few weeks later, while still convalescing, he suffered from a nearly fatal pulmonary embolism. Then in March, he suffered from a blood clot in his lung. The pain was incredibly intense. He was grumpy and nasty by his own account to everybody around him. And during many periods, he required significant amounts of morphine that oftentimes did not deal with the pain. And he was reported to say to the nuns, well, after all of this, I don't think hell is quite so bad. Hell can't be that bad. So, but as he said, he was not ready to die. He felt he had more work to do. And once recovered, he did suffer from permanent abdominal weakness that made standing or walking difficult, meaning that he could no longer paint at the easel, and oftentimes was confined to bed or a wheelchair. So, but by 1934 or 1943, so we have 2, just to walk you through these images. I'm forgetting the name of the young woman who's the studio assistant on the left, and I can't identify the woman on the right, but you see him seated at work in his wheelchair after the surgery, cutting away with pieces of colored paper kind of being fed to him. And here is, this is from 43, it's relatively early. It's such a famous image, it's the fall of Icarus. And I've cropped it in such a way that you can see the roughness of it, how it's pinned, the kind of informality of it, which I think comes through in the zoomed in bit. Notice the stick pens, notice that on the stars or the sparks, the tips of them are oftentimes bent, and you can see shadows. And that shadow is because the paper is pulling up, the yellow paper is pulling up from the blue paper. So it's not all pasted down, it's informal. And then let me go back. Oh, here. Now, he turned to the cutouts after the surgery, but the reality is he'd been working with cutouts starting in the 1930s. This is an example from 37 or 38. It's a study for a ballet. He was doing props and sets for Rouge, Le Rouge et le Noir. And you can, you see the push pins, you see the rough edges, and you see the way in which it's working. This is what he said about after his recovery from this second operation. I didn't expect to recover from my second operation, but since I did, I consider that I'm living on borrowed time. everything that dawns is a gift to me, and I take it that way. I accept it gratefully without looking beyond it. I completely forget my physical suffering and all the unpleasantness of my present condition, and I think only of the joy of seeing the sun rise once more and being able to work a little bit, even under difficult conditions. And indeed, while frequently whether in bed or a wheelchair, he kept working. And instead of a pencil or a brush, although he continued to draw, he now wielded scissors and nearly weightless sheets of paper. What's wonderful is there's footage of him making a cutout. So I'm going to shift to that right now. We'll look at that together. 1 second. Okay. Okay. Hold on, I just got to get back to my lecture. Okay, there we go. I don't know about you, but whenever I try to embed a video in a PowerPoint, the PowerPoint blows up. So I didn't, sorry about the exchange, but it's
impossible, yes.
So a couple things to note about the video, which I think is just great, and you can find it on YouTube. The incredible definite, his unhesitant scissor technique. He just sort of plows into the piece of paper. The other thing that was interesting to me was the way he was gathering the seaweed, the kind of seaweed imagery, and sort of pulling it together and bunching it up and turning it around. I don't know what to make of that, but I always think of the cutouts as so insistently flat. But that made me, the way he was kind of bunching it up and making it have this wonderful dimensionality, I think did kind of get it was as if he was kind of getting at the quality of seaweed floating or plant material floating in the water. That was the sense I got. And then you saw him in the next shot sitting at a table with pieces, playing with the composition and trying to get the composition figured out, from the pieces he'd already cut. Now, to understand how these pieces work, and to understand how he keep working, you have to keep in mind he had a ton of assistants. So one thing the assistants would do was paint sheets of paper with gouache to his specification. And he didn't tend to like the color to be too even. And even in this not very good photo I'm sharing with you, you can see the upper right corner, the kind of light green color. You can see the brush marks. Matisse wasn't interested in a completely machined surface, as if a machine had applied the pigment. He wanted it to look handmade or hand brushed. He would then arrange, we have the colored papers that the assistants would make. The papers were then passed to him. He would cut into them. And then as you could get a sense from here, if they were small, he would work on them in his bed or at his desk in front of him. But if they were large, they were pinned to the wall. And somehow I have, which you can see with, you can see examples pinned to the wall in both images if you look in the back. So he could sit in bed or sit in his wheelchair, and the assistants could pin and unpin and shift stuff around till he got it just the way he wanted it. I should say, once the pieces needed to be really finished, because obviously pinning something together, it makes it hard for them to travel, they were usually mounted on canvas or mounted on another sheet of paper, then mounted on canvas. So if you see most cutouts you see in museums aren't as sort of tenuous as all of these that are just tacked onto the wall. They've been kind of fixed and preserved and are much more stable. Now, this is called Polynesia, and there's a great discussion of how Matisse was working that I just love it. And you'll see why I like it, because it's kind of funny. So we get this sense of birds, a sense of sky and water, which is kind of marvelous with those two different shades of blue. I don't know which blue is for sky and which is for water, but I think that's what they signify. And then these seagulls that are flapping around. And then the other thing he does frequently with these cutouts is, although he signs it, you can see Matisse at the bottom, that must be the bottom of the piece. There's really a sense that you could walk around this, that there's no fixed top or bottom. And it feels very much like sometimes these pieces feel to me very much like being underwater. And all I can think is that, with a canvas, usually the canvas, not always, but usually a canvas stays put and the artist moves. But in a curious way, with cutouts, yeah, the scissors move a bit, but there's ways of cutting where you're moving the paper an awful lot. And you're shifting and turning the paper around and flipping it around, as we saw him doing. And I wonder if that sort of got him less beholden to a normal top-bottom relationship. Beyond all that, the confusion with sea and sky, with seaweed and birds, creates this and starfish, creates this really wonderful effect where you get it's up and down, it's sea and sky, and it's top and bottom all at once. So it's this really wonderful effect, but you're kind of going to giggle a bit when you realize what he was inspired by. So a studio assistant has this great discussion of how he worked on this particular piece. There you have all these birds, seagulls that would hover. Did I cut out the first bit of this. So this is a description of a studio assistant. So when he would want to paint or when he would want to make a cutout of something, he continued to draw. And in this case, he got obsessed with seagulls, and they knew that a great place to look at seagulls was on the beach in Nice, where all the sewer pipes dumped the sewage into the ocean. So they would take the cab to the beach to take a look at to see where the seagulls were feeding on sewage and trash. So this is what the assistant says. There you have all these birds, seagulls that would hover and come to eat the sewage that flowed into these areas. This created large movements of seagulls that he really likes. We would take a cab to go there, and he would sketch with his sketchbook. The shapes of his cutouts were never random. While cutting the papers, he would think of a shape he'd seen. It was like drawing, but with scissors. At some point, he became so skillful that he did not need to draw the shape. He would cut directly into the paper. So there you have all of these birds floating around, and you also hear the studio assistant talking about how he got more and more adept with his scissors. Now, that's Matisse, and that's the cutouts, and that's a very quick discussion of him. But the two things to take away from this are he integrated studio assistants into his practice deeply. He figured out a way that he could have artistic control, but also a lot of help. And the cutouts were a great way to do that. And that he felt that he was drawing with scissors, that he was practicing a new medium that was less physically strenuous for him and that he could keep doing. Now, I want to turn to Georgia O'Keeffe for the second half of this. I'm not going to go too much longer. With O'Keeffe, it's a similar it's a somewhat similar situation. O'Keeffe continues to paint, although she does make a few sculptures and begins to work in clay late in life. But she also becomes, her practice becomes very much integrated with studio assistants. And O'Keeffe had a lot more reservations about that and tried to hide it. As far as I can tell, Matisse kind of didn't care. So now we're on to O'Keeffe's work of the 1970s, when she was living in Abiquiu. And O'Keeffe would pass away in 1986 at the age of 98. So she had a very, very long life. A big part of O'Keeffe's life in these late years, in the 1970s and 1980s, is wrapped up with a complicated dynamic with a much younger artist and studio assistant and companion named Juan Hamilton. And Juan arrived to the area and began seeking odd jobs from O'Keeffe in 1972, and over the years became an assistant, a traveling companion, a business agent, and what would prove to cause a great deal of legal trouble for everybody after O'Keeffe's death. He obtained sometime in the early 1980s, he obtained sweeping power of attorney over her and her estate. This, in the end, would lead to O'Keeffe's will to be challenged in the late 1980s by her remaining family members on charges of undue influence. And the claim that she was not of sound mind by the 1980s when wills and various codicils were signed. And Hamilton eventually agreed to an out-of-court settlement to turn over a large portion of the estate to an organization that became the O'Keeffe Foundation, and today the O'Keeffe Museum. This is kind of a sad and complicated part of the story of her kind of declining state of health. And again, as much as I'm not one to dwell on these kinds of topics, I think it's really important background. And I can't not talk about it, and it's not usually where I go, but it's part of the story. And if it weren't for Juan Hamilton, she would not have been as productive as she was in the 1970s, at least. But I want to step back from the 1986 controversy. Well, wait, actually, what I want to say is these are two portraits of O'Keeffe and Juan. The one on the left, which is very informal, is one of Andy Warhol's Polaroids taken in the early 1980s. And the one on the left is, or sorry, the other way around. The left is the Warhol, the right, I can't remember the photographer, but it's a more formal picture of the two of them that's oftentimes reproduced. I thought the Warhol image was a very interesting document, and informal as the Warhol Polaroids often are. But I wanted to step back from the 1980s, 86 and her death and her controversy around the estate to the early 1970s when she remained an active artist and still very busy with issues like settling Stieglitz's estate, which although he died decades before was still unsettled, managing her own artistic legacy and just sort of dealing with paperwork. A big shift happened to her in 1971. She noticed that the center of her field of vision had disappeared. And in 1971, she was diagnosed with macular degeneration. She said, in her notoriously blunt and unpitying kind of way, I think I have a particular kind of eye trouble and there's nothing to do about it. That was her comment. But one thing she did do in 1971 was she turned to writing a memoir with Virginia Robertson, a friend. And O'Keeffe would dictate, Virginia would type it up and then read it back to O'Keeffe. Other assistants, including Juan, would work on the memoir over the years, and it would eventually be published in 1976. But she did start to paint after a couple of years. This is called The Beyond. She has macular degeneration. All the artworks I'm showing you were after the diagnosis with macular degeneration, when she had very limited vision, although she did describe it as having spots and areas of vision around the edges. And all of these works, this is a view of, it's, as she described it, a view from an airplane, sea of clouds below. Simple watercolor. And then this drawing from 1976. All the painting she made with studio assistants. And we have a very good, we have relatively good records of the various assistants she had. And the interesting part was she wanted people with no artistic training. She wanted people who would just do what she told them to do, period. So she kind of preferred, and they would make a mark. She could see a certain amount from her peripheral vision. She'd sort of take a look and tell them to do something else. When she wanted a mark at a certain place on the canvas, she'd touch the canvas and tell them to make the mark there. It's a very interesting process, and there's some pretty good descriptions of it. This was also made this way. These two are very large. What happens with macular degeneration is your central core of vision is limited, but you have peripheral vision. So very large things can come through and can be seen. This piece also was surely made with the assistant of the intervention of an assistant who she was directing. And my guess is the extreme contrast between red and green she could take in. I've seen this watercolor in person. It's gigantic. And there's a number of watercolors she made in the late 70s that are just massive. That must have, and so my guess is because of the size, she could kind of take it in and direct it. This, I'm pretty sure she made herself with no intervention from 76. It's supposed to be palm trees, which sort of makes sense in retrospect, but it just doesn't work. It doesn't quite cohere, and that's just kind of a fact. Then we've got, this is O'Keeffe with Hamilton, and I'm also wrapping it up. I'm almost at the end. This is O'Keeffe with Hamilton. He was a potter, and he got her, she wanted to encourage his artwork. He had a kiln, and he was throwing pots, and she began to take up some sculpture. And these are this sort of piece on the extreme left that just looks like a long stick or tower, and they're both kind of phallic looking to me, I have to say, but you know, anyway, interesting. She made herself, and this other piece in the center she made and molded. She was able to mold herself because she was just, you know, working with her hands. In the photograph, it's from the 70s. There's a painting behind her called Memory of a Day with Juan, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. And then another sculpture that she first modeled in the 1940s, but only cast in the 1970s. So when she turned to sculpture in a more sustained way because of her loss of vision. I want to wrap up by talking about this series, though, of Memory of a Day with Juan. And because she did not paint it with Juan. Juan was out of town. He'd gone to New York for a number of weeks to deal with business for her. And in fact, a guy named Mr. John Poling was the assistant that worked on this. And this series, I like them. I think they're very powerful images, and they've been compared to the Washington Monument. But the simple, what one gets in a very elemental way is this sense of looking up to the sky with some kind of structure or occlusion that's in the way. And you see her working out different permutations of it. I don't remember the dimensions of these, but it's quite large. So Juan Hamilton was well established in the household by this point, but he hired his John to come in and kind of be the handyman, read Miss O'Keeffe's letters, do all the work that needed to happen around the house that she couldn't do, help with correspondence and legal matters. So Juan is away. This gets painted. Juan comes back and felt that John Poling was sort of becoming too close to O'Keeffe and sort of kicked him out. There was a big falling out, but they'd worked on these pieces together. Poling then complained in a very public way when O'Keeffe published these images and did not mention his intervention and his work on it. And so a public spat ensued. And eventually O'Keeffe says, and this is in the press, that Mr. Poling was the equivalent of a palette knife, which annoyed Poling a lot. But the point in making all that, the point in spelling this out and going through this story is that while Matisse wasn't so concerned about all of his assistants, O'Keeffe went to great trouble to hide her vision issues and didn't want people knowing about it for understandable reasons, because of the market, because of her dealer, because of her sense of privacy. But this conflict between John Poling and Juan Hamilton, which is centered on this painting, which of all things is called Memory of a Day with Juan, I think speaks in a kind of complicated and slightly unpleasant way to the way in which, while Georgia O'Keeffe was still writing her memoirs, making business decisions, and continuing to paint, she was very much dependent on these people, mostly men, but also women who came in and helped her out in the house, and women who were friends, but very much dependent on them to continue to produce. And it makes for a kind of awkward and not wholly savory story. But when I look at these pictures, I don't really care about that. I think they're really marvelous, very simple abstractions. In a sense, they're not compositionally complicated. They really do get this profound sense of ascent and moving up with very minimal artistic means. Okay, that is my presentation. I'm eager for questions or thoughts on directions to take it. And thank you all very much for letting me present something that's I've never talked to people about this before, so it's very raw and new.
James, one comment that I have immediately is, I love the way you take the aging process and it just sort of humanizes these people. And, it's a commonality that we all have. It's this going through this experience of the aging process, and it just sort of brings their work down to that human level. Does that make any sense?
Yes.
Yeah, I think when you think about the fact that Matisse, it took me a bit of research to figure out what Matisse had been sick with and what
Right.
the nature. I don't think it was hidden. It's just people don't talk about that, and particularly colonoscopies. People don't. That's not something people talk about. But yeah, that's my goal. I'm watching older people in my family go through the aging process, and it's kind of rough. I think filling this in for kind of filling in this background for artists, I think is, it's part of the context, and it humanizes people. And it also makes me at least appreciate their perseverance and that they want to keep making. So thank you.
I think this was fabulous. I loved your discussion. I think it would make a great book, and it needs to be out there, and I think this is the time. And when you go to have a presentation in the museum, we have some fabulous people in our community, like Joyce, who's right here, and we have others that, like Tony Askew, in their 80s, and they're fabulous. They're doing some of their greatest work. They're very respected in the community by artists. And I've always thought the Santa Barbara Museum should focus on some local artists and kind of bring them in with works like you've just discussed.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I'd like to make.
I think you turned off.
Yeah, I think you muted yourself, Joyce.
Unmute.
There we go.
I did unmute. Go ahead, Thor.
Oh, okay. I just wanted to make a point to follow up on that. The original director of the Santa Barbara Museum of Art was Donald Bear, 1940 to 1952. Unfortunately, he died of a heart attack. But one of the things he did, he went out to the community. He said, we'll have one annual show with local artists. And he did this for many years. And when he died, that was the end of that. They said, we're not going to do that anymore. And then up to the date, there has not been. And so this, I think, with the new, James, I was very impressed with this, a lovely presentation. And I think this is a chance to follow up and maybe see if the directors and the board would be open to some opening it up to a better relationship with local artists.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
I have a suggestion also about Monet as an artist who had cataracts and in fact saw things very blue. And I think the work, his paintings at the Musée Marmottan in Paris with all that brick red in it are a result of the cataracts that he had then actually had the surgery. And then he goes into the late works like the water lilies. And so I think that's another kind of physical possibility. The other artist is a woman by the name of Vera Clement, who is a Chicago artist who taught for decades at the University of Chicago, but wrote about art and aging, and in fact was the keynote address at the American Council on Aging in the late 80s and has written eloquently about art and aging.
Okay, thank you for that reference. And I appreciate that.
I had some suggestions
Please.
for artists that David Hockney, I don't know if you want them dead or if you want living artists as well, but David Hockney in the DVD of the bigger picture really shows how he worked in his 70s and how he used his assistants and how he would film himself working and then watch the films in the evening of how he worked. So David Hockney came to mind. Also Catherine Murphy, when she had cancer and continued to work really staunchly. Chuck Close with his problems. Also El Greco and Goya, certainly their styles changed immensely as they got older. So those people came to mind. And thank you so much for this great lecture. Thank you, James.
It's I should say I'm not, there's all sorts of sensitivity around aging and art with artists. And even today, today you think with the way the art market works, no one cares if someone's studio assistant made something or not. We're in the age of Jeff Koons, so, but there's still sensitivity around it. But no, I'm absolutely interested in all sorts of practices. It's easier with someone like O'Keeffe because the information's out there. And it's been written, and with Matisse, it's more accessible. So it's a nice place for me to start and begin to think about the issues. But Hockney looking at himself making art is super interesting. That's, I have to take, but definitely have to look at this. And thank you for the suggestion about Catherine Murphy. I appreciate that.
James, there's also a professor at Stanford. He's a professor of ophthalmology who's written at least one book. You probably know about this, but it's specifically on the eyesight of artists and how it's affected, or how he thinks it's affected their work. But it's very well documented. For example, Monet is a great example, but he actually did some of his water lilies before the cataracts were removed and some after, and you can compare the colors, and there's just amazing differences. There's also a great book, which you probably know about, called The Last Painting, which is the last painting from Giotto, I think, to Twombly. And you can, for many of the artists, I think it's their best work. And I even think, didn't Matisse think that the chapel was his best work when that was done last? I mean, so I loved your talk, and I think it's very optimistic for us all. So keep up the great work. I'd love to see more of this.
I will say one thing. I didn't want to go, it's a fine line, because there's this sort of like Van Gogh crook over the wheat field thing. And I'm not like, I'm interested in art as a sign of living and vitality. I want to really focus on that. But thank you for that's the part of the story I want to focus on. We all know what happens later. We don't have to go there. Let's focus on the vitality part.
Yeah.
But thank you for those references. I appreciate it.
James,
Thank you for
James, you
talk.
might also want to check out de Kooning's last work, which I think is, a little bit fraught with mystery as to how much he did and how much his assistants did. But those last paintings that he did are just enormous and serene and beautiful.
He's someone thank you for that. I didn't talk about him today because I didn't want to go. I didn't want to go 12 different places, but he's certainly someone that's on my list to think about. He's pretty well documented. And yeah, I know with those late paintings, people either really think they're horrible or like them. At least in the arts community, there's no middle ground. I do know the way in which, or my understanding is the way in which those late pieces collapse space. There's not the same sense of pictorial depth and the kind of simplification of them as compared to his early work. I'm not saying I agree with this, but some people see that as indicative of his cognitive issues at the time, and I think he was later diagnosed with Alzheimer's. But yeah, that's what you point out is really great. It's very, very interesting. And boy, do those paintings, at least among people I know, it's very strong views. They either really like them or really don't like them. Anyway.
my mother,
Dan Lynch. Renoir is a pretty famous example of this also. By age 71, he had rheumatoid arthritis very badly.
Yeah.
In fact, I'm going to shoot you through the chat an article about that impairment and the disability and how he coped with and what strategies he used in order to overcome, in a way at least, or augment the arthritis with regard to his work. And that immediately came to mind. I wonder if the Impressionists also, given the fact that they were post-Impressionists, given more liberty, were able to still remain productive after physical disability into aging in a way that other artists that perhaps practiced a different form of art would not have enjoyed.
That's a very interesting question. I don't know, but that certainly seems like
I'll stick this article in the chat for you if you're interested.
Thank you.
I'm struck by the fact that these are all Western artists, and I wonder if the same bias exists through time in Asia. Do you have any information on that?
I have a little bit. The one thing I'll back up and say, and why I wanted to be really clear, this is very preliminary, is the topic of aging is gigantic. It's
Yeah.
like, it's absolutely massive. And so I've got, part of my job is to sort of figure out what I can actually do that where I'm not like making a mess, so to speak. So the answer to that is I don't know. I'm not there yet, but I do know that Hiroshige, his most famous images were produced very late in life.
Mm.
Particularly the great image of Mount Fiji. And he stated, and he was quite emphatic about it, that he couldn't have done it when he was younger. You know, it took him this long to get to this level of kind of concision and elegance. So that's, but yeah, the one thing I'll say is the topic of aging is very current, and there's a tremendous amount of literature. It's just, as you can imagine, the population of the US and lots of other countries is getting older, and people are grappling with that. But thank you for thank you for kind of pushing me on that. That is definitely an area I've got to do more work on.
I remember Grandma Moses became famous when she was old. My mother happened to lose her sight, and she still painted as she grew older, and the colors did change in her work. I'm not that young myself, and I'm still painting plenty, so I don't think my work has gotten worse, probably better.
Yeah. Okay.
Speaking of Grandma Moses, you might want to, I mean, didn't she start painting later in life? I mean, she wasn't painting like a whole lifetime. And then also Beatrice Wood, I think, started very late. So it might be interesting to compare people that don't have the history of art work with, you know, just starting suddenly in their aged years. And I wanted to say, you apologized a couple of times for looking into these things and talking about issues that you say you don't really usually look into when you think about art, but I, don't, because that is, especially in an older person, there's a lot of history, I think maybe younger artists are able to hide their life situations better, maybe, but it is absolutely relevant in any piece of art, what the person is going through and stuff like that. And then there was something else I wanted to tell you, and I can't think of.
Okay.
We have to do this again.
Yeah, this was great. Thank you.
Absolutely fascinating.
Thank you for letting me kind of test this for an audience. You all are
Anytime.
So you get that when you have to do something for an audience, it's a little different than when you do it just for yourself. So, but this is very helpful.
Frankly surprised that there is prejudice in artists that are old. When I graduated in poetry from Columbia University, I knew there was prejudice if you were female. So there's so many prejudices. It's amazing to me, especially art, because that's from your soul. It's not an age, except for the physical issues.
Yeah, I guess the other thing, so I don't think there are a number of artists of very advanced age, Lucida Hurtado, for instance, who painted and did not show very much until she was 95 or 100. There is kind of an interest in older artists who have been active a really long time, but who have not gotten a lot of recognition. And they tend to be women artists for all the reasons we know. Women artists get sidelined by all sorts of other stuff, and did not have the same exhibition opportunities or market opportunities until relatively recently. And then for some reason, my brain is not working. Huguette Huguette Kayland is another artist who's since passed away. And then oh, she had a show at the Whitney like 3
Carmen
years ago.
Herrera.
Carmen Herrera, yeah, thank you. So there's definitely an interest, and I would say that some of the bias against some of the bias I think is unconscious, but it's nonetheless around, and then I just think it's a really interesting intellectual problem.
James,
Right.
I think you're referring to the prejudice of presentation. I think given the way social media has taken over our lives and the world, just by virtue of the fact that it's a new media, that the younger generation tends to grasp it and understand it and manipulate it more than older generations do. And through that process, we sort of get pushed aside, I guess.
Well, yeah, although I'll say one thing that's been curious. So there's all these things I've learned, and my memory is fading today for some reason, but you know, there's another aspect to this, and this is clinically proven that there's been studies. People as they get older don't really care less and less about what other people
Exactly. They
think. And
don't.
that's real. That's not like a stereotype. It is documented. And I think that is really interesting from an artistic standpoint. There's an artist named Jo Baer, B-A-E-R, who I don't know. I know the work. I have not met her, but she became somewhat well known in the 60s and 70s for these very austere abstractions, kind of like sort of like John McLaughlin, for those of who, as a point of comparison. And lately, she's turned to these, how would I describe them? Landscapes with waterfalls and deer frolicking around with flowers. I mean, it's very, at some level, a very conventional, to go from a very restrained, hard edge, abstract way of working to, by the end of her, you know, well into her career, and you know, probably approaching the end of her career given her age, she's doing images of these sort of idyllic, Edenic landscapes, and boy, they don't really fit with a narrative about what people think her work is about. They're very hard to square with what she did before, and the abstract pieces everybody knows. And while I have not spoken to her, I have a sense she's doing what she wants to do and is not too worried about it. But that's been, that aspect of getting older, I think, is very important for creativity. You just sort of, you do what you like, and if the market likes it, other people like it, great, and if not, whatever. But this goes back to your social media point. Social media is all about approval from other people.
Absolutely.
And you know, when people are younger and they're trying to figure themselves out, you know, peer pressure and peer approval is very real. But I don't have a social media account. I guess at some point I may have to, because these days curators are supposed to do all that. But I'm out of the game for a while. I may have to go back, but not for a while. Anyway, well, this has been a lot of fun for me.
I'll tell you, I love Instagram. It's so easy to put something up, and then some people like it, so you feel good.
Yeah, that's the whole thing of social media. I'm not anti-social media. There was this point of like, and I have, you know, my partner has a kind of social media account so we can see what other people are doing, but I don't have my own account. But it's fun. It's fun. It does create community, and it certainly makes researching artists a lot easier. I mean, you know, you can find stuff very quickly. Well, I am going to get going, but I really appreciate the invitation and all of your comments and questions and enthusiasm, which I have written down and will shape me moving forward. And stay safe, and please, when we fully reopen later in the summer, please stop by. And in the meantime, A few galleries are open, but just make sure you get a timed reservation.
Thank you very much.
Well, thanks a lot, James.
Bye.
Really appreciate you doing this,
Stay
man.
safe, everybody.
Awesome.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Wonderful.
And thank you, Eugene, for being such a great moderator.
Thank you, Michael.
Yeah,
Bye,
this was
everyone.
really an idea to have this talk. This was fantastic. Thank you so much.
Have a
We're
great
going to
day,
do this
everyone.
again. All right.
Ooh, yeah,
Thanks a
with wine.
lot.
In person.
With wine. It sounds like a
Yeah.
deal. All right.